Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. If you don't know me, my name is Saul. I'm a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist, and I'm really interested in human behavior because that's what I spend all my day thinking about and talking about. And so I wanted to make a bunch of videos about that topic, and I hope it's helpful. Just a reminder, this information is just for education. If you have an actual healthcare concern, you should consult a licensed healthcare provider or your licensed healthcare physician. And of course, in the United States, in case of emergency, you can activate emergency services by calling 911. All right, so today I wanted to talk about the first topic that came to my mind, which is why is it so darn difficult to deal with human behavior? Well, maybe it's difficult to deal with behavior in all animals, but I think human behavior is particularly challenging for a lot of people. And we in the mental health profession spend our entire work week talking about it and thinking about it. So I wanted to share some of my thoughts and hope that it's educational for you. So yeah, why is it so difficult to predict behavior, and why is it so difficult to have an influence on it? Why is it so hard to get people to change how they're doing things? Sometimes the person we're trying to get to change things is ourselves, but sometimes we're trying to change other people's behavior. And whether we're trying to change our own behavior or another person's behavior, sometimes it can be pretty darn difficult. And why is that? So let's start out with that question. I think one reason why we have a hard time with it is because we're all pretty much convinced that we know it. We know it all. We know the answer. We think we know the answer anyway. You know, people spend a lot of time behaving. And I don't mean that in like the Austin Powers way of like, oh, behave. Like, no, we just spend a lot of time producing behavior of many, many different kinds. And we're really interested in our own behaviors, and we're really interested in the behaviors of other people. We spend a lot of time watching movies and reading books and telling stories and making up stories about our own behavior and other people's behavior. So we pay a lot of attention to our behaviors and the behaviors of others. And I think sometimes we think that it's all pretty obvious. You know, we think we have this thing called self consciousness or self awareness, which we think is like a special human thing. And one of the things that's most important to explain about ourselves, if you read like blogs about psychology and behavior and philosophy, a lot of people think that one of the biggest problems we have is how to explain our own consciousness of ourselves, our self consciousness. And there's a lot of fancy words that you get used for that problem. I'm just going to use scare quotes there because I'm not sure it's the problem that we think it is. But the bottom line here is that I think we have a hard time predicting behavior because we think we are experts simply because we do so much of it. We do a lot of behaving, and we watch a lot of other people doing a lot of behaving. And so I think sometimes we just assume that we're kind of like experts. But this might not actually be so effective to think this. I mean, think about it for a minute. Do you fly around on planes? Is that something you've done a fair amount in your life? Or if you don't do a lot of flying, do you ride around or drive around in cars? Or do you talk on your phone? I saw some statistic lately that I think it's like 80 to 90% of the world's population has a smartphone. So, you know, we live on a planet with 8 billion people, and 80 to 90% of those people apparently have a phone. So I'm guessing that a lot of us do spend a lot of time talking on our phone, even if we don't spend a lot of time in cars or on planes. But even if you did spend a lot of time on a plane or driving in a car, would that make you an expert in aviation or car repair? Just because you spend a lot of time talking on your phone, which 80 to 90% of the world's population apparently does that make all of us experts in computer programming? I don't think so. So it's curious to me that that we don't think that spending a lot of time with a phone makes us an expert in how a phone works, but maybe we think that spending a lot of time with behavior makes us an expert in behavior. And so I'm wondering if we're making this interesting mistake about behavior that we don't make in regard to other things. Do we believe that somehow behavior is obvious in a way that a phone or a car or an airplane isn't obvious. And I'm wondering if maybe this is because, we are pretty aware of our own thoughts. We spend a lot of time thinking and talking and writing and texting, and we spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about thinking and talking and writing and texting. So a lot of our thinking is about thinking, actually. And the 17th century Western European scientist slash philosopher famously said, "I think, therefore I am." And I think he was expressing this idea that thinking seems to be something really obvious to all of us. Like, we do a lot of it. It readily comes to mind when we think about our own behavior. Oftentimes, the first thing we think about is our own thoughts, and we spend a lot of time thinking about thinking. And so, therefore, it kind of makes sense that we would treat thinking as something that's very obvious just because it's always there. It always seems to be there anyway. Whenever you think, automatically, thinking is the thing that you're doing. So it might be kind of obvious that it's the first thing that comes to mind when you start to think about what's important. Well, I'm thinking. So thinking is the most obvious thing. But, it kind of, it's kind of like we're assuming that what is most clear is the most relevant for prediction, that clarity is the most relevant factor when we're trying to figure out how to predict something. I think that we oftentimes believe that thoughts, just because we're so readily aware of them, and because we spend so much time with them, obsessing over them, if you will, therefore thoughts are themselves the most predictive part of ourselves. That thoughts are the things that we should pay attention to when we're trying to figure ourselves out, just because thoughts are the thing that's always there. And this shows up, I think, in the way we try and pass judgments on people's behavior. If you think about how people are judged in a court of law, well, somebody who is considered to be guilty of a premeditated act is oftentimes considered more guilty than a person who didn't premeditate the act. That is, somebody who didn't think about the act. Premeditated murder is a more serious crime than other kinds that are not premeditated. And we have different words for those other kinds, like uh, involuntary homicide or something like that. But the law treats those things differently. Premeditation is treated differently in the law than just kind of spontaneously doing something without planning for it and without thinking about it. And I would imagine if you asked people who work in criminal law, if you ask them, like, why is that, they might come up with some kind of justification like, well, somebody who premeditates something, somebody who plans a crime and thinks it through, might be more likely to commit that crime again in the future. So they should have a harsher penalty so as to discourage those kinds of crimes. Whereas crimes that are just the result of spontaneous action, people don't think it through, well, maybe those are not as serious because they're not as likely to happen again. I don't know. I'm just kind of hypothesizing about why the law might take premeditation into account. And I suspect it might have something to do with, we think that premeditated behaviors are more likely to continue because they were planned out. Therefore, we should have harsher penalties in order to discourage them. But is that right? Is there any evidence that thinking, premeditation, planning, the way we think about things is the most important factor when we're trying to predict our own behavior? In fact, there are convincing data that thinking and talking and writing are not always the most important predictors of behavior. It is commonly stated and clearly understood that thinking is the most important factor to take into consideration. But I think there are data to indicate that that's just wrong. It's just factually and empirically not necessarily the right answer, and it's not consistent with some of the data we have. So why is it difficult to work with behavior? Why is it so difficult to predict people's behavior, and why is it so difficult to influence people's behavior? Well, I think one reason might be simply because we're paying attention to the wrong things. We're spending a lot of time paying attention to thinking and planning and meditating and premeditating and purpose and intention, when in fact those might be the wrong things to pay attention to. And if we paid attention to more predictive things, we might be better at predicting and influencing. So here's some examples of how our language memorializes what I think is a real bias. We have words like intention and goals and values and meaning and motives and purpose and objective and premeditation. And when we're trying to figure out people's behavior, I would imagine a lot of these words come up. Like we think, oh, I wonder what his goals were, or I wonder what her intent was, or I wonder if she thought this through, or I wonder what his objectives were, I wonder what their motives were, I wonder what their purpose was. And so we go through a lot of self-talk with this kind of vocabulary, with the very healthy and well-intentioned goal of trying to figure things out. But the question is, are we focusing on the wrong things? What if this is wrong? What if in order to predict behavior, we need something less obvious? I mean, intention, thoughts, goals, those can be fairly obvious. We can talk about them. We can ask someone, well, what were you trying to do? And they might give us a very clear answer. And then we might think, aha, now I get it. They told me what they were trying to do. They told me what their purpose was. Or we might say to someone, what does that mean? When you say that, what does that mean? And they might tell us the meaning. And we think, oh, now I understand what's going on. That's very obvious. It's very clear. But it might not be the right thing. We might need something less obvious. We might need something less related to thinking, talking, writing, texting. We might need something less accessible to so-called common sense. And what if we paid attention to those less obvious things? What if in the process of paying attention to those less obvious things, we got better at predicting behavior? We got better at influencing behavior. What then? Well, if that's true, then I guess the next question is, how would we do that? How would we gain access to these other data sets, to this other information that isn't so readily available? Well, the first thing is we can start paying attention to what we're paying attention to. We can start paying attention to paying attention. And one way to do that is to become oriented to something that sociologists and psychologists have learned to call implicit bias. This is not a complicated idea. Let's break it down. Bias just means that there's a tendency or a pattern. If you see a pattern, we can call that bias. In this case, bias is just a synonym for a pattern that you are perceiving. So that's the bias part. The implicit part just means that you're not aware of it. You're not aware of the tendency or the pattern. Maybe you're not aware of the tendency to steer to the left a little bit when you put your foot on the brake. Who knows why you learned that, but it might just be a pattern. And it's not like it's necessarily becomes dangerous. You just steer to the left a tiny little bit, a couple inches. It doesn't take you into the path of oncoming traffic. Doesn't cause an accident. But maybe somebody who's driving with you one day notices, hey, I notice you turn the steering wheel to the left a little bit when you're slowing down to a stop. And you might say, oh, I never noticed that. So that's an example of a pattern that you're not aware of, behavior that you're not aware of. That's all implicit bias means. One way to get rid of ineffective habits is to become more aware of them, especially when they are a part of our implicit bias. So if our implicit bias, that is behavior that we're not aware of, is to pay attention to other people's thinking behaviors, we can become aware of that, and maybe we can redirect our attention to something else. Here's an example of implicit bias. A bat and a ball are on sale for the combined price of $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, a lot of people are going to give a very typical answer to this that's wrong, but we can perceive that pattern in the population. We can perceive that people tend to give the most obvious answer, which comes to mind. So that's a bias. And then we can show them how they were wrong. And once they become aware of how they were wrong, they can understand what the correct answer is. Now, when I first saw this question, I immediately knew I had to work it out like a word problem. And so I just wrote down how to work out the word problem like I was taught in high school. And I got the answer, but I actually didn't believe the answer. I got the right answer, but I was like, wait a minute. How could that be right? Because I've got this instinctive answer that just feels so much more correct. And that was an example of me kind of struggling with this implicit bias that I was experiencing, even though I knew the right answer because I had worked it out with a pen and paper. I still didn't quite believe it. And so that implicit bias was kind of still pulling me back to what seemed most obvious to my brain. And there was a real struggle that went on in my head about it. So a lot of people get that wrong because the answer that most readily comes to mind is 10 cents. But I think if you work it out with pencil and paper, you'll find that that's not the right answer. And then you might yourself go through that struggle of like, oh, but 10 cents seems like the right answer. How could this other answer, which I know intellectually is the right answer, it just doesn't seem right. So in the same way, I suspect that what most readily comes to mind about how to understand someone's behavior is often questions like, what was their goal? Or what did they mean by that? Or what was their intent? Or did they think this through? Or, that kind of thing. But that might not be the best way to think about behavior. One of my favorite YouTube teachers is Eddie Wu, and he's a math teacher. And he has tons of videos on YouTube, and one of them is called Think Deeply About Simple Things. And I think that's really what we need to do. We need to think deeply about simple things, and just because they appear simple and straightforward doesn't mean that they are simple and straightforward. And behavior is one of those things that I think is apparently very simple and straightforward, but not at all simple and straightforward. Just like the answer to that word problem was apparently, the answer that popped into your mind was very simple and straightforward, but the real answer, not so much. So I think one way to start to get better at dealing with human behavior is to pay attention on purpose. Start paying attention to the things that look simple to you. Start paying attention to how you make predictions in your everyday life. How many of those predictions are accurate and how many are not? What's your batting average on a typical day? You could ask yourself, what factors did you take into account for your prediction when your prediction was right, and what factors were you taking into account when your prediction was wrong? Maybe just start jotting down some notes, just like you probably had to do when you were solving that problem about the bat and the ball. You jotted down a few notes, maybe you jotted down some equations, maybe you even used some of your high school algebra, which is what I did. But you might have had a different method. You might have drawn some pictures. You might have drawn some diagrams. Who knows? What factors did you take into account when your predictions turned out to be right or effective? And what factors did you take into account when your prediction turned out to be wrong or ineffective? Just start to take some notes. Pay attention on purpose. When you pay attention on purpose, that's the antidote for the implicit part of implicit bias, because now you're doing something explicitly. Explicitly just means you're aware of it. You're doing it on purpose. Implicitly means you're not aware of it. You're not doing it on purpose. So oftentimes the antidote to implicit bias is explicit paying attention. Other predictive factors that you might start paying attention to, besides people's thinking or intentions or what they mean or whether they premeditated something, other things that might be more predictive, just some suggestions. Don't know if these will work for you, but these are just some suggestions to kind of get the creative process going. You could pay attention to the environment, thoughts and goals and purposes and values, that all has to do with us. But there's this whole world out there. Why are we ignoring it? Let's pay attention to the world. Maybe there's something out there in the world that can help predict people's behavior. Or you might know something about their past, what they've experienced in the past, what they've learned prior to the behavior that you're observing. Maybe that's important to pay attention to. Maybe they turned the wheel of the car a little bit to the left just because once they were driving down the road, and as they slowed to a stop, an animal like a squirrel ran out into the road from the right. So they had to turn to the left to avoid it. And now that's just become a habit for reasons that they don't entirely understand. They just don't feel comfortable if they don't do it. Sometimes we call this superstition. Superstition just refers to behavior that occurs, and we don't really know why it's occurring because we can't really identify anything that's actually happening because of it that seems to be useful. We're just doing it. And when we don't do it, we feel uncomfortable. And when we do it, we feel more comfortable. So maybe there's something about somebody's learning that you know about that can help predict their behavior. Or we can just try and be more effective. We can just say, hey, what makes things worse? What makes things better? You know, if a parent is yelling at a child for a behavior and then that child keeps doing that behavior and in fact increases the amount that they're doing that behavior, is the yelling making things worse or better? I don't know. That's up to you to decide. Are emotions coming into play? You know, sometimes I think that we're paying attention to behavior sometimes I think we're paying attention to thinking as the most predictive value because we think that there's some kind of logic going on and we're trying to figure out the logic. Like we say to people, walk me through your thought process. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure out what logic applied here. But logic may be totally irrelevant. We're not always controlled by logic. Sometimes we're controlled by emotions. Sometimes it might be more effective to pay attention to people's emotions rather than their logic. And emotions don't always have to do with thinking because sometimes emotions are impulsive and immediate and they happen without thinking, before you can think it through. You, what's that phrase? Look before you leap. But sometimes logic, that's how logic might work. Look before you leap. That might be logical. But the emotional version of that might be you're leaping before you look. So maybe we should pay attention to emotions. Or maybe you're measuring the outcomes in the wrong way, you know? Maybe you're just missing things because the way you're measuring what happens, you're just not taking into account other things. So maybe you need to be a more careful observer of the outcomes. Maybe you need to use different methods of measuring the outcomes. Just because the way you're measuring the outcomes, you're missing things. And that's normal. If you're looking through a telescope, you're not going to see what's happening right at your feet. Maybe somebody just taught you to kind of look through a telescope all the time, and then you're just not paying attention to what's happening at your feet. That's probably a normal error that people engage in, I would imagine. You know, people are taught to play the long game, you know, always pay attention to the long-term outlook. Okay, yeah, that might be great sometimes, but that's kind of like, oh, I'm always going to use a telescope. Always, always, always. I'm never going to take the telescope away and see what's happening right here. Maybe that's a bias that somebody learned. What are your expectations? I remember reading a story about a famous poet. The name slips my mind at the moment, but he was telling the interviewer that he wrote poetry every single day. He wrote a poem every single day. And the interviewer said, well, but they can't all be good, right? So how do you deal with the fact that sometimes you write bad poems? And he said, oh, I just lower my expectations. So maybe if we change our expectations, we can change the outcome. We can change what we're paying attention to. We can change how our implicit bias is showing up in the world if we just change our expectations. Who knows? These are just some suggestions, like I said, for getting the creative ideas flowing, not necessarily recommendations, but to start working with this idea of implicit bias more